Thank you all for coming. I think we're about to get started. If you don't yet have a source packet, there are still a few more in the middle of the on the shulchan. Oh, and I have an extra one. Anybody still missing? Okay, so I'll put it on. I want to begin by revisiting a moment, a text that we looked at last week. I think a bunch of you were not here last week. I don't know if whatever. If you weren't here, you're welcome to and encouraged to watch the video recording. one text that we saw that sparked a lot of emotion, and I saw online discussions afterwards, was a letter that Ursula Vejcik wrote and allowed to be published in the 1959 book on the sanctity of the synagogue about Mechitza, where he says, it's forbidden to pray in a synagogue that has mixed seating, and he even goes so far as to say it's forbidden to hear shofar on Rosh Hashanah and fulfill your mitzvah d'oraita, your biblical obligation, your shofar, in a synagogue with mixed seating. That's how serious the issue is, and it was. It's a shocking severity, right? I want to say though, and in my own sort of personal biography, I think I first read that letter when I was probably 15 or 16, and from the time I read that letter, I haven't prayed in a non-Orthodox synagogue with mixed seating, that I don't think so. It had a big impact on my life, sort of realizing that a religious leader of my community saw the stakes in such a stark way, and at a time in the 50s when the boundaries were so fluid and it was not obvious what the difference was and what it meant, and were these differences significant, to have somebody draw down a line and throw down the gauntlet and say, this is a boundary, this is the definition of our community, may have been really, really crucial. I guess the question we're going to look at today is, once you have boundaries, then you have to ask, what do they signify? Because in the 50s and 60s, as Orthodoxy was becoming distinct from the conservative movement around issues like Mechitza and separate seating, the worshippers at Orthodox and conservative synagogues were mostly identical in the way that they personally practiced Judaism. And they were mostly identical in being not very observant. When I say not very observant, I mean they went to work on Shabbat, they drove cars on Shabbat, and things of that nature. Okay, and that was most people in Orthodox synagogues. That was most people in conservative synagogues certainly in the 40s and 1950s into the 60s. And so we're going to try to sort of figure out what happened to those masses of non-observant Orthodox Jews. Where did they go? What became of them? I don't know, they're not all gone. Maybe some of you here are not observant Orthodox Jews. But what happened to this as a mass phenomenon, and what are the, I guess, positives and negatives of that shift? And we're sort of tying that into the rise of the day school movement, which may or may not be a correlation of that shift. I want to go back though, like I did last week, and tell a story from Europe. We spoke last week about the emergence of Orthodoxy in Hungary and how that played out, and the formation of a separatist Orthodox organization, and we talked about the status quo communities that refused to take sides and what happened to them. So this dynamic then moves to Germany really a few years later, and some of the same players who were active in the creation of Orthodoxy in Hungary actually moved to Germany, and they take part in the same fight in Germany. I forget the years, 1860-something, 1870-something, the German government permits Orthodox Jews to secede from the organized Jewish community, like, again, much of Europe. Religion, once Jews are emancipated, then they sort of are organized by the state. Religion is supported by the state in most European countries, and depending if you're Catholic, Protestant, or Jew, your taxes go to support the Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish religions, religious apparatus, and it's, I think, still like this in many European countries. And in the 1860s, 70s, thereabouts, okay, the Orthodox community gets the right to be treated as a separate religion from regular Judaism, right? Just as the Catholics and the Protestants are separate and they're not treated as one religion by the government, so too, Orthodoxy won the right, there was a parliamentary vote to be treated as a separate, distinct religion. And here too, the same split in communities took place. Communities had to decide. If you were a Sam Shmuel Hirsch, who championed this move, called in German Austritt, which I think means secession, I guess, separating. Sam Shmuel Hirsch felt that it was forbidden for an Orthodox Jew, a believing Jew, a faithful Jew, to be a member of an organization, a Jewish organization, that wasn't committed as an organization to Torah and mitzvot and Orthodoxy. So you couldn't participate in, if your general Jewish community was led by Reform Jews, which was the case in Germany in the late 19th century, you could not be a member of such an organization. You had to secede, and there were indeed separatist Orthodox communities that formed in many German towns. Interestingly, most Orthodox Jews didn't listen to him, and the greatest halachic scholars of German Orthodoxy resisted Rav Sam Shmuel Hirsch and wrote and said, no, it's actually permissible to remain a member of the general Jewish community called the Gemeinde community. I think Gemeinde means general community. Oh, the Gemeinde. Okay, so you could be part of the Gemeinde, part of the general Jewish community. You did not, and you could, as an Orthodox Jew, your Orthodox synagogue could remain part of the Gemeinde, and on condition that they gave the Orthodox community control over kashrut, and they didn't interfere in the affairs of the Orthodox synagogue. Yes?
When you say the great Orthodox halachic scholars in
yes.
mostly disagree with Hildesheimer, who else?
Hildesheimer was interesting. I think Hildesheimer actually may have supported. Hildesheimer was a member of a separatist, it was a rabbi of a separatist community, in fact, even though he was much more liberal on some other questions. I'm referring to the Würzburger Rav, whose name was, he was from southern Germany, the Würzburger Rav, okay, who was a greater posek than Sam Shmuel Hirsch. They exchanged letters and back and forth, and he says permissible again, as long as they give you this basic autonomy over your religious affairs, you can be part of the. And again, this is about where which cemetery you can use, and do you have to set up your own nursing home, and et cetera, et cetera. And he felt that was not necessary. And even in Frankfurt, even in Rav Shmuel Hirsch's own shul, most of the worshippers at his own synagogue retained their membership in the general Gemeinde. Because they wanted to be buried in the cemetery where their great-great-grandparents were buried. They didn't want that. So that question of that development of two different types of Orthodox community is a helpful framing for developments that take place also in the United States. Because even though we don't have state-sanctioned religion, there was never a general organization quite as official as existed in Europe. I think Orthodox Jews have been confronted from the earliest history in the United States of whether or not we're going to be Gemeinde Orthodox, we're going to be Orthodox and participate in the broader Jewish community, which here that would mean, to be involved in the federation system, for example. That's the clearest, example of that, or not, or to be separatist Orthodox and really sort of not be involved in communal affairs. And there are lots and lots of, internal Orthodox polemics about what type of participation in non-Orthodox Jewish organizations is appropriate and what is not. It connects to Zionist participation. The Zionist movement, when in 1902 the Mizrahi is a religious Orthodox faction of the Zionist movement, that's a big thing. That was the first time an Orthodox organization was a minority faction in this sort of broader movement. That was a significant move. I think Zionism presumes a kind of Gemeinde attitude. That's the point, maybe. And then in the United States, again, participation in the Synagogue Council of America and all sorts of interdenominational rabbinic councils. It's here in Chicago. It's very interesting. As a general rule, with a handful of exceptions, Orthodox rabbis are not members of the Interdenominational Rabbinic Board. There's the Chicago Board of Rabbis is an interdenominational board of rabbis. It has a handful of Orthodox members, very few. Generally, Orthodox rabbis don't participate because it would be, granting legitimacy to the other rabbis. So most Orthodox rabbis are not members. There is, however, something called the Rabbinic Action Committee, which is a overarching coalition of the Chicago Board of Rabbis and the CRC. And so, even though Orthodox rabbis, what?
And no other.
Under the auspices of the Federation. Yeah, exactly.
No other rabbinic order.
No. It's just a local Chicago thing. So it's like, even though, so they won't participate in the, they won't join the board of rabbis, but they will participate as, through this rabbinic action committee, and they do joint, things together. They gather once a year and they do this and that together. They issue statements from time to time. So it's sort of interesting. To me, it's like finessing this issue in a strange way. Yes?
But then you have the Aguda, which won't join the CRC.
Correct.
Because they have some traditional rabbis grandfathered in who served congregations without mechitzas.
Yeah, no, and the Aguda has always been, right? Aguda has always been, so that's sort of one of their, the history of Aguda, maybe we'll talk about that next week, the history of Agudat Yisrael, but that goes back to Europe, and they're much more separatist and insular, for sure. Although I'm just, as I'm saying this, I'm wondering if it was actually true that Aguda was always in favor of Austria in Europe in the early. I'm not certain, because the Eastern Europeans were against Austria, all of them. And the Tziv was against it, and all the Eastern Europeans were against. So I don't know. Okay, we'll table that. You have a quote on the first page here from Jeffrey Gurak, the scholar of American Judaism. During the first half of the 20th century, if and when an American Jew attended a synagogue, he or she most likely prayed and socialized in an Orthodox house of worship. However, most of these Orthodox synagogue goers, drawn from among the masses of Eastern European Jews and their children, who then constituted the majority of American Jews, were not especially punctilious in their adherence to the demands and requirements of Jewish law. Okay, so that's like an overall statement. This is an article he wrote, 20th Century American Orthodoxy, Era of Non-Observance, 1900 to 1960. So a broad sweep of time where Orthodoxy was the dominant denomination as measured by number of synagogues, number of houses of worship, and their membership or people who worshipped at them. Again, think of the waves of Eastern European immigrants who felt most comfortable in Orthodox shuls, but those waves of Eastern European immigrants, they all worked on Shabbos. Not all of them, but most of them. Why do they work on Shabbos? They had to, you had to, right? Because Saturday was a work day for most of American history, and you could not keep your job if you didn't work on Shabbos. The institution of the Hashkama minyan in American Judaism, like an early Shabbat morning minyan, existed to enable people to go to shul and to daven Shabbos morning and then go to work. That was why Hashkama minyanim were created. Similarly, the late Friday night service was something that the conservative movement initiated, but many Orthodox synagogues did so as well. That because people were, let's say Shabbos starts this week at 4 or something. Many people are still at work at 4 something. So have a 7 p.m., 7:30, Friday night tefillah, and that enables people who work to come to shul, on Shabbat. And that was also a popular davening time in Orthodox synagogues as well in the early 20th century. A number of things start to change. There's the shift towards a 5-day work week. So the 5-day work week is the product of decades of struggle by the labor movement. Here in Chicago, you had the Haymarket riots, 1886, right? Famous event in Chicago history, in the history of the labor movement in the United States. And whatever. I studied it in school. I did not remember. The Haymarket riots were over the 8-hour workday and the 5-day work week. This was a radical demand of the labor movement that was not met, and so they had this big mass gathering, and people died at the Haymarket riots. It was a sort of very momentous event, but that was the issue. 1908, the first American factory adopts a 5-day work week. It was a mill in New England, and it was explicitly done to allow Jewish factory workers to observe Shabbat. 1908. 1919, there are mass strikes of unionized workers. The union that would, sort of the precursor unions to the AFL-CIO, the AFL and the CIO, were involved, calling again for an 8-hour work in 1919. The 5-day work week comes into existence finally after, again, decades of struggle in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standard Act, which is one of the, Roosevelt's New Deal pieces of legislation. It was the culmination, again, of generations of agitation, and it's what allows people to observe Shabbat in the United States. It was, I think, the number of professions that were included under the Fair Labor Standards Act has expanded over the years, and there's been subsequent legislation, especially in the 1960s, that also protected people. If you are a university student and your exams are on Saturday, you have a right in many states to have those exams, take those exams on Sunday. Right? There's legislation in many states that protects your right to take an exam not on your Sabbath day as a religious minority. Those bills were mostly passed in the 60s or later. The civil service exams are not, they're scheduled on Saturday. You have the right to have them taken on a different day. That's the creation of, it's like, the Fair Employment Practices Division of the federal government in the 60s was active on, again, essentially allowing Sabbath-observant Jews to participate in the modern American economy by legislating the right to take exams, etc., on Sunday instead of Saturday.
Agricultural workers and domestic workers were never included in legislation of this kind. They happen almost all not to be welcome.
Right. That's another important element of the history of the New Deal. Correct. But even by the there are also very few Jews who were agricultural workers or domestic workers, even as early as the 30s and 40s, very early on in American Jewish history. Blue laws in New York State end in 1962. Rockefeller signs legislation ending blue laws, again, explicitly trying to be fair to Sabbath-observant Jews who, they have to keep their stores closed on Sunday, and their stores are closed on Saturday. That's a huge burden on them. And Sunday was this country was founded in part by people who wanted a more restrictive, really restrictive blue laws. Okay, the Puritans came here because they wanted to impose a very, very rigorous Sabbath in public spaces, and for centuries, or generations, that was true in much of America and certainly New England. And it's really in the 60s, with the breakdown of the WASP establishment, with the rise of multiculturalism and the celebration of religious diversity and the inclusion of Jews into the Catholic Protestant Jew sort of vision of American religion, these blue laws are eliminated in most places. Not Bergen County still has them for some reason, but most places don't have them anymore. Let's look through some data about the rise of day schools. If you look on page 3, you can see that this is from an ASBI Foundation. You can see just the number of schools of various kinds. It's a 2-page chart, so you can see by grade the number in each system of school. So 77 centrist Orthodox schools, 80 Chabad schools, 137 Hasidic schools, 97 community schools, 19 immigrant outreach schools, like for Russians or Bukharins, or a lot of those in Brooklyn and Queens, 83 modern Orthodox schools, 13 Reform day schools, 39 Solomon Schechter day schools, 34 special education day schools, 282 yeshivas. I'm not exactly sure how that's different. I guess yeshivish as opposed to, that's ultra-Orthodox non-Hasidic, 282, for a total of 861 Jewish day schools in the United States. People have quibbled with these numbers, but they're as good as any. They try, if you can imagine calling, 137 Hasidic schools for 4-year-olds, right? And asking how many students do you have enrolled in your school, and you come up with a number of 9,015, right? So they're certainly trying to count every child. You imagine it's not fully accurate, but ASBI has really tried to come very close with this data. It's interesting. I think it's kind of fun to look at the data and see how the numbers shift. You have, do you have like a drop-off in certain ages and why, and who goes to school, right? Like for example, right, there are a lot of Reform kids in K through 8, but there's no Reform high school, right? So no Reform Jewish high school in the United States. You can see the numbers for Schechter and all the different trends. You can also see that Orthodoxy is mostly non-modern Orthodox. Okay, that's something to also remember. That there are 81,000 Hasidic 12th graders, which is an enormous number. Somebody suggested, actually this is a total tangent, but if there are like maybe 150,000, I don't know, you can do the numbers, whatever, 150,000, 200,000 Hasidic Jews under age 18 in the United States, if they have a 5 or 10% attrition rate, where they leave the Hasidic community, and maybe it's much more than that, but let's say 5 or 10%, which is a low attrition rate, that still results in more like non-Orthodox but Jewishly literate, reading Hebrew, like Jews in the United States than any other educational initiative, like Dwarf's Birthright or anything happening on Hillel, or right? I mean, like who can get like 10,000, right? I mean, if 10% or 5%, you still have 5,000 or 10,000 people a year who are, sort of there in America. They're not Orthodox, but they have this very intense Jewish education. And if you could connect them to Jewish life in some way, the pool of people that they could populate, is dwarfs almost anything else happening in Jewish education or outreach or whatever. So that's engagement, etc. So massive numbers. Okay. It's also interesting to see, I think on page 5, you can see the numbers as they've shifted, which is also interesting. You can see a really sharp, from 1998 to 2013, a dramatic decline in the Solomon Schechter student population, which is, I think, something really, really tragic to see. It looks like the implosion of the conservative movement played out in Solomon Schechter enrollment. It's not quite as bad as it looks, because I think some of the Solomon Schechter schools have converted to being community schools as a way to broaden their whatever constituencies, and so it might not be quite as steep a decline if some of those schools have shifted their affiliation. Yes, Ava? I'm sorry, what? And that one has fewer students than the two had, presumably. Yeah. No, that is a story. Community high schools have people who used to be. Yeah, no. So it could just be a trend. Maybe that type of, if you have a community high school, you can get Reform kids and Orthodox kids, and it's a stronger basis for a school. I don't know. I don't think it bodes well for the conservative movement that this Solomon Schechter movement was like a jewel in the crown of the conservative movement for generations, and it's struggling right now. And again, you can see just the dramatic increase in the Hasidic school populate, from 12 increase of 24%, from 1998 to 2003, and even whatever. So you can look at the numbers and examine them.
Rabbi,
yes.
Classify the community school?
I think they call them. I think that's what they're calling themselves. It's not a Solomon Schechter school, that's for sure. And I think it's. I would. So therefore, what? Yeah, that's what I mean. It's not affiliated with the synagogue. It's not affiliated with the movement. So in that sense, they would be a community school. I know, right? Chabad, it's I don't know how they're counting the Chabad schools. The Chabad schools has two kinds. They're Chabad schools for everybody, they sort of operate as a service to the broader community, and there are also Chabad schools that are just for Chabad kids. Our son Noam went to one of those for a year, so it's a very, very different experience, I can tell you. It's a very nice school. But, so page 6, you can see how these schools are growing and sort of how the numbers kind of explode. 1940s, 1940-41, 35 day schools with enrollment of 7,700 students, only in 7 states and 7 communities, okay? And then by 1963, you have 306 schools with 65,000 students in 34 states, 117 communities. So you can see how those numbers expand. They don't have complete data, but it's pretty good. You can see in the 40s they're sort of growing, and then 50s, 60s, they grow, and I guess we're missing the 70s. But I think on the next page we have on page 7 you can see the 70s, right? So the number of new American Orthodox schools. In the 60s there were 84 that were founded, 117 in the 70s, 148 in the 80s, and 155 in the 90s. So the number of new schools is still growing, but again, look at table 5, you can see where that growth is. It's in recent years, it's mostly Haredi schools, right? That's where the population boom is happening in Orthodoxy. But again, the other schools, modern Orthodox schools, are still being founded, even in the last generation, 38 from 1985 and present. So as these schools are being founded, as the schools are growing, what else is happening in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s? What's happening is the percentage of American Jews, and even the absolute number of American Jews who affiliate Orthodox, is shrinking dramatically, right? From a majority of American Jews who affiliate Orthodox to a very small percent. That's what you can see on my 1950 and 1970 Orthodoxy declines from more than 50% of American Jewry to approximately 11%. That's a decent, right? That's a steep decline.
What page are you on?
That's the first page. That's one of the quote. That's one of my timeline little factoids. Okay.
Is that still referring to people who affiliate Orthodox
Yes.
or not?
Yes.
Any
Correct. So it seems to be that what's happening is that the non-observant Jews, the immigrants or the children of immigrants who went to Orthodox shuls, who were going to Orthodox shuls in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the older generation died out, and the younger generation moved to conservative or Reform synagogues. And those who remained in Orthodox synagogues were a much smaller committed core, much more likely to actually be personally Orthodox in their private lives, to be personally committed to a more robust, comprehensive, holistic observance of mitzvot with an Orthodox perspective. And day school education is part of that. This story that the Jewish community tells itself is that, like, the founding myth of the of the Orthodox community is, we used to send our kids to public schools and take care of Jewish education on the side, and then we realized that wasn't working. We had mass attrition, and we switched to day schools, and from that point on, we started retaining the young generation, and things have been good since then. And that's when our community shrunk, but then it's grown from this committed core. And you can see, like, a sort of correlation. You can see the community shrinking down to those who actually are committed to living an Orthodox life at the time that day school education is expanding until, like, almost all, observant Orthodox Jews choose day school educations for their children, with a, small, fringe movement of people rejecting that because of finances or whatever other issues are barriers for them. So that's like the data that supports the founding myth.
There's another factor here.
Yes.
As the Jewish community became more affluent, they want to leave in their city. So in the 50s, in the greater Longdale area, there were 300,000 Jews. So where they all moved to? Most of them moved down to the suburbs where you didn't have an Orthodox support service. So you just didn't have it. Yeah. So, correct. No, so, right. I mean, there are reasons why. There are reasons why the conservative movement was very well prepared to move out to the suburbs and appeal to these suburbanized Jews, but there are also Orthodox Jews that are moving to the suburbs too. They seem to have lost out. It seems that for whatever reason, or constellation of reasons, those who continue to feel comfortable in Orthodox synagogues after, let's say, 1970 onward, were those who were, like, personally observant of an Orthodox life to a more rigorous degree than was true a generation earlier. And those who weren't felt more comfortable in other kinds of synagogues, as a general trend. And day school education, again, may have been a necessary element of allowing that younger generation to feel competent, participating in shul life and doing mitzvot and learning Torah in an observant Orthodox community, whereas maybe their parents or grandparents it was mimetic, or they didn't feel so comfortable participating because they didn't participate, they didn't go to shul very often, so it wasn't necessary to them. Or maybe it inculcated a certain effective commitment to a lifestyle to the community. There are a few. I want to say counter. Like there's another important trend that's also part of this. Another, go ahead.
You were implying that it's a myth that it was the day school
Yes.
that turned it around.
Yes.
But rather.
So here's a counter argument. So one counter argument is, on the one hand, one of the fuels of day school, especially, this was, I saw and skimmed very, very quickly a doctoral dissertation about the growth of non-Orthodox day schools in Los Angeles that posits that they got traction when school busing began as a form of school integration. And so the switch to day schools was a way for the Jewish community to avoid integrated schools, and that is also a piece. So it's not only about this new discovered, like, for Jewish commitment, this is how we inculcate Jewish commitment. It's also about how do we keep our kids away from kids that we don't want our kids to be in school with, which is a sadder story, but I think that's a piece of it. That's certainly a piece of the migration of the Chicago Jewish community from all its various locations. That's a sort of a dark underbelly of our community's story. Another important piece, though, the observant core of the Orthodox, like the post-19, the more recent generations of observant Orthodox, they might not be the actual physical descendants of the non-observant Orthodox. It may not be maybe none or almost none of the non-observant Orthodox from 1930 have grandchildren who are today Orthodox, and today's Orthodox synagogues might be mostly populated by a later wave of immigrants who came to the United States after World War II.
right? I don't know. We could do like an interesting survey, like what percent. I don't know, just like I don't know. If your ancestors came to this country before 1918, I'm going to raise your hand. Okay. If they came after 1945, want to raise your hand? Okay. So. Okay. So I have two. I have my mother's family. I'd say my mother's family, who were, they were a mix of communists and like Glatt reform. They came before 1918. And my father's family, who were Orthodox, they came in 1949. You have a wave of immigrants, right? The Jews who came to America were, to some degree, were not the most, they were not necessarily the most pious. Certainly, they came to America at a time when there were great challenges that we've seen to being observant because of, like, you had to work on Shabbat. And then the Jews who came after World War II were very religious, and especially a lot of Hungarians survived the war because the Germans went to Hungary at a later stage of the war. And so you have lots, and others who managed, whatever it means to survive the war, many of whom were quite Orthodox. They came to the United States in the 40s and 50s, and they tried very hard to rebuild Orthodoxy, and in particular, this is the origins of right-wing Orthodoxy in the United States. That's a post-war phenomenon, but also many of those people populated modern Orthodox congregations and communities as well. The Torah Masorah, 1941, the Telz Yeshiva opens in Cleveland. Had been in Telz before that in Lithuania. Beis Midrash Gavoha is established in Lakewood, New Jersey, with Aaron Cutler in 1943. 1944, Torah Masorah, which is a day school network of Orthodox day schools, is established. And so that's also a piece of the story. It could be that the observant Orthodox community is almost like a second. The non-observant Orthodox may have been entirely left Orthodoxy, maybe closer to 100%, and our communities might be, to a large degree, populated by those who came later. That doesn't seem to be true of the audience here, but I'm not sure it may be true. Yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, I would say growing up in Jewish day schools here, as someone whose grandparents had grandparents born in Chicago, I was maybe like the only one. Like 5% of an Orthodox class had relatives here before 45.
Yeah, I think that sounds resonant. That's similar experience that my wife has shared when she felt like left out when they would learn about the Holocaust because all her grandparents were born in America, and that was unusual for her. She went to a Schechter for elementary school, and that was unusual.
Well, I think that the figures that we saw earlier would testify to that because the yeshivot, Haredi, and Hasidim, who are the vast majority of the participants in these schools, are virtually entirely post-World War II immigrants to the United States. The number of people living in the Haredi world, Hasidic or non-Hasidic, who are third-generation descendants of Reform, conservative, or assimilated Jews is probably infinitesimal.
Correct. Although many of them weren't Hasidic per se, but they were Orthodox when they came to America in 1950 or 45 or whenever it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how gender difference plays out here, because in my family, so that came back in the day, so the men would work because they had to, and the women would be shomer Shabbat.
Fascinating. That's fascinating.
Yes. That was also true with the development of Reform Jews in Germany, that religion was kept for longer by women who maintained this home religion while men stopped going to synagogue. So that's a trend even in general.
My great uncle, who was born in Germany and spent his childhood in Germany, in a German Orthodox family, he told me that he had a tradition in his family. So it's almost 100-year-old tradition that if the wife is observant, then it can work. If the husband is observant, it won't work. That was his family's philosophy about these sort of mixed marriages, which is a little different than what you're describing. You're describing the men have to work. And Jeffrey Gurak, in his book on the history of American Orthodox Judaism, has a very poignant scene describing his childhood in the Bronx in the 50s, and one of the most pious members of his community who would learn with the kids, and he would spend, and they would never use electricity in their home on Shabbat, certainly more, and they wouldn't eat anything non-kosher outside the house, more meticulous than Professor Gurak's own family at that time. And so he was a real religious role model of in that community, and but he worked on Shabbos because he would get up every Saturday morning and go downtown because he felt he had to do that for a period of years. So that was, and I have a cousin who married a woman who's whose father or grandfather, I'm trying to remember the story that I heard, but just he lost his job every week. They would say on Friday, come back tomorrow, don't come back Monday. So he wouldn't come back Monday, and he'd have to. So for a period of years, he had to find a new job every week. All right, two or three more points I want to share. Another shift towards day schools in the 50s and 60s. It comes from a sense that Jewish identity can't be conveyed in a mimetic, natural, like just picked up, breathed in from the atmosphere, the way it had been true in earlier times. If you think of, just how, even today, like in certain like neighborhoods in New York, where like if you're not Jewish, it's like you're Jewish because there's so much like Yiddishkeit in the air, etc. And as that breaks down, as Jews become more acculturated into America, there's a need to replace that natural Jewish sensibility with something more concrete and real in content. I was once on an interdenominational rabbinic panel with a Reform rabbi who no longer lives in Chicago. He was at Sinai for a period of time, which is like the classic Reform synagogue. I'm not sharing it. He said this in public. He himself is not like Jewish halakhically. Like he's a patrilineal Jew. He went to like a local Orthodox shul frequently because he loved Daf Yomi. They were happy to have him there. They didn't count him for the minyan, but he like learned Daf Yomi with them. Like interesting guy, I thought. And he said on this panel, if I were convinced, I believe that Reform Judaism is the form of Judaism that's most compatible with multicultural democracy, and if I were to lose my faith in democracy, I would go and become Orthodox. I would like undergo conversion, and because my Reform Judaism, like this is the modern, enlightened like form of Judaism that is consistent with multicultural democracy and the way in which we live. And I was sort of stunned by that. Like it was very powerful. I thought it was a very powerful statement, bold statement. Like if I lost my faith in democracy, I would become. I don't know what he's doing now, but had I had the presence of mind, what I would have said was almost the opposite. That if there were, precisely because of the freedom and openness of American society, that's why it's so crucial to have lots and lots of content to one's a robust, thick form of observance, because otherwise there's so little that is distinctly Jewish now, whereas a generation earlier in the old urban neighborhoods where like my Sarah had a great aunt who called herself a Yiddish-speaking pagan. Like that was she. Was not at all observant, but Yiddish was her first language, and like just her whole ethos was so Jewish, and all her friends and family were Jewish, without there being any religious content whatsoever to her Jewish identity. And that doesn't seem to have survived. Like that form of Yiddishkeit, that form of Jewish identity, is now very, very, because we're not living in tight urban neighborhoods and immigrant families, and that's not how the lives we live. We live modern American lives, and so there needs to be some content. I think the rise of day schools and the rise of observance, I think it's not a coincidence that would coincide with the erosion of secular Jewish identity. And what poignant description of this is Chaim Soloveitchik's essay, the end of Chaim Soloveitchik's essay, Rupture and Reconstruction. Everyone should read this essay. Super important, really modern classic. What?
There's a more popular version of it that was in the moment.
Really? Oh, this is pretty popular, I thought. All right, maybe. All right, okay. I didn't know that. Here's how it goes, okay? I'll read, but okay. In 1959, I came to Israel before the holidays. Having grown up in Boston and never having had an opportunity to pray in a Haredi yeshiva, I spent the entire holiday period from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur at a famous yeshiva in Bnei Brak. The prayer there was long, intense, and uplifting, certainly far more powerful than anything I had previously experienced. And yet, there was something missing. Something that I had experienced before, something perhaps I had taken for granted. Upon reflection, I realized that there was introspection, self-assent, even moments of self-transcendence, but there was no fear in the thronged student body, most of whom were Israeli-born. Nor was that experience a solitary one. Over the subsequent 35 years, I've passed the holidays generally in the United States or Israel, and occasionally in England, attending services in Haredi, non-Haredi communities alike. I have yet to find that fear present to any significant degree among the native-born in either circle. The 10-day period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are now holy days, but they are not Yamim Noraim, days of awe, or more accurately, days of dread, as they have been traditionally called. I grew up in a Jewishly non-observant community. This is Chaim Soloveitchik, okay, son of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. I grew up in a Jewishly non-observant community and prayed in a synagogue where most of the older congregants neither observed the Sabbath nor even ate kosher. They all hailed from Eastern Europe, largely from Shtetl like Shepetovka and Shnibishuk. Anybody here from? No? Most of their religious observance, however, had been washed away in the sea change, and the little left had further eroded in the new country. Indeed, the only time the synagogue was ever full was during the holidays. Even then, the service was hardly edifying. Most didn't know what they were saying, and bored, they wandered in and out. Yet at the closing service of Yom Kippur, the Ni'ilah, the synagogue filled, and a hush set in upon the crowd. The tension was palpable, and tears were shed. What had been instilled in these people in their earliest childhood, and which they never quite shook off, was that every person was judged on Yom Kippur, and as the sun was setting, the final decision was being rendered in the words of the famous prayer, who for life, who for death, who for tranquility, who for unrest. These people did not cry from religiosity, but from self-interest, from an instinctive fear for their lives. Their tears were courtroom tears, with whatever degree of sincerity such tears have. What was absent among the thronged students in Bnei Brak and in their contemporary services, and lest I be thought to be exempting myself from this assessment, absent in my own religious life too, was that primal fear of divine judgment, simple and direct. Indeed, skipping a few paragraphs, I would go so far as to suggest that individual divine providence, though passionately believed as a theological principle, and I do not for a moment question the depth of that conviction, is no longer experienced as a simple reality. With the shrinkage of God's palpable hand in human affairs has come a marked loss of his immediate presence with its primal fear and nurturing comfort. With this distancing, the religious world has been irrevocably separated from the spirituality of its fathers, indeed from the religious mood of intimate anthropomorphism which had cut across all the religious divides of the old world. It is this rupture in the traditional religious sensibilities that underlies much of the transformation of contemporary Orthodoxy. Zealous to continue traditional Judaism unimpaired, religious Jews seek to ground their new emerging spirituality less on a now unattainable intimacy with him than on an intimacy with his will, avidly eliciting its intricate demands and saturating their daily lives with its exactions. Having lost the touch of his presence, they seek now solace in the pressure of his yoke. Wow. A powerful sentence, right? So that's, yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, all right. Give it a few moments, like, okay, go ahead.
I thought it kind of trash what he's saying, because I think that when you're talking about people, and I think of my grandparents who went to Kings once a year, they thought of their parents who were God-fearing Jews, and they were there once a year, and they knew we grew up in this, and we spoke Yiddish in the home, and we had religion, now we don't, and there's a kind of sense of guilt, as well as a yearning for something, and that is where that all comes from, as opposed to people who go to show every single day and have a wider, complex relationship with God. They have that fear, but they also have the awe of that on the young man. And so I think that people who go once a year, it's a little different. They're going to be like awed by the huge atmosphere, as opposed to people who are there every single day.
We're less frightened because we're more intimate with. So okay, look, I would say when this was published, that line at the end, was the most controversial thing he wrote, and it sparked several different responses that were published, and back and forth, all in the mid-90s. So it's a controversial thesis. There are alternative explanations, as you point out. He argues in the paragraphs I skipped that you think about Tevye, who his horse goes lame, or he oh God, why do you have to do that? My horse, why? I don't know that many, even very religious, deeply pious Jews today, I don't know if I missed the bus. God, why did the bus have to come 2 minutes earlier? That sort of the intimate, close sense that God is, manipulating their lives in a very small way, I think is absent, and he argued was much more common in Europe and that immigrant generation, and so that also feeds into this. Linda, yeah.
I read this differently, in the sense that I think that we get ourselves nuts, or many people become in my mind, some days, with having the exactitude of how to do everything. And that kind of burden is, at least to me, this is what that's speaking of. That instead of having a sense of a gestalt, of a you know, a different kind of relationship, that we're imposing upon ourselves a kind of meticulous and far more meticulous kind of need, necessity to get every...
So you should read the article. It's available in many places online for free. It's worth reading. I mean, it's a long article with amazing footnotes about that, precisely that shift and why and what it means and what precisely is the shift. This is just one sort of ending sort of explanation for why that occurred.
Right.
He has some other ideas that he offers, the breakdown of a Medic tradition, you switch to book learning, etc. I want to offer, a few comments, and then I'll want to say a few comments. Present two more ideas in the closing minutes. Yes?
Yeah, just about this article.
Yeah.
I encountered this last line a long time before I read the first article. So so when I finally read the whole article, it just seemed like his description of what it means to have the touch of God's presence was unappealing even to him. Like the language that he uses to describe it.
That's interesting.
Like it's on the one hand like kind of condescending, and on the other hand a little bit like
interesting.
Like that they're selfish, that they're self-interested, that they're a little simple, that and it was like that he wanted it to be appealing, but that it wasn't appealing even to him.
Interesting. Well, Madoff he was born in America, so it's just he is what he is. He's a modern person. He accepts a scientific worldview about causation. Scientific causality is just how he was raised and how he sees the world, experiences the world, and he can't escape that. But he's sort of noticing something about the shul, the Rav shul in Boston had a different ethos.
I remember my first Rosh Hashanah in the show in '67. The fear of Rosh Hashanah, the day of Yeshiva, the first day the davening was over at 3:45 p.m. And I feared Rosh Hashanah as much as I did Yom Kippur.
Where was that? Which yeshiva was that?
Denver. Lakewood Offshoot.
So we should have gone to Denver. Maybe he went to the wrong yeshiva.
And I remember the Muslims was saying how the Gedolim in Europe, when they ate fast because it's the Yom HaDin.
Wow.
And it was palpable.
Wow.
It really was. And I feared Rosh Hashanah in Yeshiva.
I would say Rosh Hashanah Yeshiva for me was very intense. And a culmination of a season of introspection and Musar and all that. But I don't know if it was a lot of crying. I don't know. That seems a little bit. That I don't think I've experienced. Slichot a little bit, but a little different. Okay, I want to say a few more ideas. Plus minus. What are some advantages, disadvantages? So Orthodoxy is now a very small percentage of American Jewry. We're still about 11%. It's not. If the Hasidic birth rate continues, we'll be. Most of. I think there'll be. Like 25 senators will be Hasidic by 2072 if present trends continue. But present trends usually don't continue. Orthodoxy is still a very small percentage of American Jewry, but the percentage of Orthodox Jews who are observant is much higher than it was, a generation or 2 or 3 generations ago. So it's a community that has more coherence. What's gained, what's lost, and day school education is now, is ubiquitous in Orthodox communities with some rumblings because of cost and dissatisfaction and the charter school movement, etc. But it's still, the default is still day schools, with arguments have to be made against day schools now, right, at this point. So one thing I just want to point just in terms of school mission, because that myth that we tell, which has some truth, but who knows how much truth, that the day schools are what caused that transition of now Orthodoxy is retaining its youth, and now Orthodox Jews are observant because we've switched to the day school model. One downside of that story is that we think of our schools as being, like the goal of our schools is about affiliation, and it's like an affective goals as opposed to like cognitive or intellectual goals, and so it just, I think maybe like the amount of actual learning that takes place at our day schools suffers, right? Or because it's just not, like the reason why parents send their kids to day schools because they want them to grow up to be just like them in their, to replicate patterns of observance, as opposed to instead giving my kid a Jewish education because I want them to learn Torah, for example, right? And so, it's sort of shocking, how the lack of Hebrew literacy among people who have 12 years of day school education compared to someone who studies French in high school, right? Right, I think makes, right?
You mean Hebrew language?
Hebrew language, like somebody who, It's what?
Doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist in these, right. And even in the modern schools which teach Hebrew language as a course, it's not the same, not taught as effectively as French is taught in a public school. And I think that, and there's I think Talmudic literacy. I had a conversation. The yeshiva high schools, the yeshiva world, the Haredi high schools, probably have 2 or 3 times as much Talmud education per week than modern Orthodox high schools, and so it's sort of interesting. What's the school on Sunday? It's 15, 20 hours at school, right? So, and whatever it is, it's not, and more hours during the week, and less other things, less time for PE, less art, less whatever it might be. Longer day. It's the different. It's a dramatic difference, and then I don't know if there are. I'm not suggesting that that's an ideal, but I think it raises the question. Like what are we sending what is the goal why are we investing this money, communal money, family money, tuition money, right, and hours and hours in this education? What is it about these effective, Israel education, right? We want our kids to love Israel, which is a very strange, it's not really an educational goal to inculcate love. You want, maybe you want your kids to know something about Israel, to know the history of Zionism, to know something about Israel, but actually what we really want is we want the kids to love Israel. So that's we want them to love the Torah as opposed to knowing the Torah, right? I think because of this story, it kind of confuses us about our educational goals, right? And I think maybe to the detriment of actual I'm sending my kids to a day school. I want them to be able to learn Torah with literacy and fluency and a certain standards of excellence in what they actually ought to know. Another point I want to introduce. Yeah.
But I think part of that reason is because there's in the community schools you have kids coming from.
Sure, of course. Yeah, of course. I'm not. Thank you for. I'm not criticizing any individual school and its educational priorities. Every school has all sorts of stakeholders with all sorts of conflicting interests, and I was even targeting Orthodox schools with just the fact that which was yes, thank you. Let's say every school is making a great decision, the 100% best decision based on its stakeholders.
The kids would be able to get help from their parents because their parents are not Hebrew literate.
Yeah,
it would be too intense.
Yeah, I don't know.
That exists in Orthodox schools too.
Yeah.
I would say the average modern Orthodox school in America does not effectively teach Hebrew. That people take Hebrew for 12 years, and most of my peers can't speak with any sense of fluency.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I want to say something. Very briefly. Okay, maybe it's 8:57. If you can maybe lend me 3 minutes, and I can say this in 6 minutes. Adam Ferziger presented a thesis which I find very compelling, in which he talks about the question of constituency definition. In the 1950s, as the yeshiva world was just getting off its legs, and as modern Orthodoxy was the only form of Orthodoxy that was really prominent in America, the modern Orthodox community defined itself as having a mission to serve the broader Jewish people, as being relevant to the broader Jewish people. So you have you can see the records of the established modern Orthodox congregation, like KJ in New York. You see the writings of the rabbis Lookstein, about how maintaining their moderation and their modernity and fighting against the right-wing, agenda is what allows them to be relevant to the broader Jewish community, to encourage families to affiliate with their shul, send their kids to Ramaz, get them involved, etc. And this was a source of pride for modern Orthodoxy in the 1950s, that rabbis spoke English well and had college degrees and had a message that was relevant to the broader community. And at that time, very emphatically, the nascent yeshiva world was arguing the opposite. Rav Aaron Cutler, moved out to Lakewood. Why did he go to Lakewood to build his yeshiva there? What was in Lakewood? Lakewood was chicken farms. Okay, he went to Lakewood to get away from everything else, to be in isolation. He felt that he wanted something pure that was a few handful of students that he could seclude and just give them lots and lots of Talmud in isolation, and that was that model. Over the generations, there's been an almost complete role reversal, where most modern Orthodox communities are fairly religiously homogeneous. If you go to the big modern Orthodox shuls in Skokie, everyone there is Shomer Shabbat, everyone there keeps a kosher home.
no one, or almost no, I know one person for a fact who drives to Ortara most weeks, but I think that's an exception. And the training of modern Orthodox rabbis is focused on, sort of assuming that you're going to be teaching and speaking and working in a community of day school educated, yeshiva educated balabatim, congregants, all of whom have already bought in to a system of Torah and mitzvot, of an Orthodox lifestyle. And all of the outreach that's coming from the Orthodox community and serving the broader is coming from the Haredi world. It's Chabad, it's Eshet Torah, it's Lakewood Community Kollels, or Sameach, and similar organizations who've sent out, outreach operatives across North America. There are more, according to one estimate, which may be false, but it could be true, there are more Orthodox outreach professionals than non-Orthodox rabbis in the United States, in North America. Sure, why not? There aren't that many of them, but why not? Sure. 9 out of 10 rabbis, or 7 out of 10, I don't say 7 out of 10, I'll be moderate. 7 out of 10 rabbis on college campuses are Orthodox rabbis. The overwhelming majority of them are Haredi, Chabad, or other like Lithuanian outreach, Maimonides, Aish, whatever they may be. And so it's a really interesting role reversal. That's sort of all sorts of reasons for that. There are all sorts of implications for that. I wonder what it means for those Orthodox shuls, those modern Orthodox shuls that have still retained a sense of mission of being relevant and being a Jewish resource for a broader spectrum of the Jewish community, not just those who are observant or are going to become observant, etc. And that used to be like all of that was modern Orthodoxy. That was all of Orthodoxy in the 50s. That was a defining feature of modern Orthodoxy in the 50s, and it has now been sort of ceded mostly to Haredim. I think there are, however, a handful of congregations, of modern Orthodox congregations, that see themselves in a different way. I think this is one of them, okay? If you look on the back page, you can see some results from a survey that the shul sent out over the summer. Most of the survey was about evaluating the shul and the people who work for the shul, but we snuck in this question, because I was really curious to see the answers to these questions. And you can see some interesting, diversity, there's some religious diversity in this congregation. Okay, so how important is keeping a kosher home? So that's very important to 72% of the respondents. It's important to another 19%. But not eating in non-kosher restaurants, that's not at all important to 35% of the shul. That's an interesting, right? That's I don't know that these numbers would be. If these numbers were run in other synagogues, I think the numbers would be very different. So, and you can see not using electronic devices on Shabbat is very important to 40%, but not important to 16%, for example, right? I think that so these numbers suggest what you all know already, that there is a great deal of religious diversity in this congregation. And I guess what I would just sort of hope that you remember from this week is that the religious diversity of our shul is not it may be an anomaly in the world of 2017, but historically, synagogues like this one are actually quite consistent with the history of Orthodoxy in the United States in the 20th century, and I think we should be proud of that. And personally, I think it's important to find avenues for religious growth and religious education for everyone based on what is an authentic and a meaningful pathway that they would be on. But I think also we can be proud of the fact that our shul serves as a resource, a Jewish resource for anybody who wants to use us as a Jewish resource, and that means students at a Catholic university who've never been to a synagogue before, who want to know what a synagogue's like, and that means people who come to Minyan 3 times a day, and that means people who are not at all interested in keeping kosher, but want to daven, at the synagogue down the street from where they live, etc. And I think we can be very proud of our efforts to be a resource for all of those people and others. Okay, it's 9:04, so I kept you an extra minute. Thank you so much. Next week we are
exploring women's tefillah groups and their history and the controversy that surrounded them, and using them as a way to examine the polemics and battles over modern orthodoxy that took place in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so we're getting fun times. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.